Welcome to Always On, the podcast about brand reputation and data-driven communications. I'm your host in Copenhagen, Shahar, and our guest today is Torod Neptune, Senior Vice President for Corporate Marketing and Chief Brand and Communications Officer at Medtronic, which is a global leader in medical technology with over 100,000 employees across 150 markets. Great to have you with us today, Torod.
Happy to be with you.
So let's start. We like to start in a very simple way. Just ask you, how do you describe yourself when you meet somebody who doesn't know you?
In the spirit of trying to be creative about a role that is still hard to define, even for people who've known me for quite a while, I'd probably suggest a business and operations leader who's adept at helping a company compete and win in the marketplace.
And how do you describe yourself beyond your career and your job?
I'd say a global citizen who is passionate about cultures and connections and stories and authenticity.
So let's talk about the beginning of your journey in communications. How did you first get into it?
Before I actually got into communications, I got into it by really being exposed to the power of storytelling. And storytelling through the lens of making really complex issues plain, simple, and helping audiences, people understand. In many ways, the imperative of issues or concepts that weren't clear, weren't obvious to them, their importance, their significance. And that was largely through politics. And so I grew up as the child of politicians. And from very early on, I remember being on the campaign field and witnessing this art of being able to make the complex simple and engaging audiences to try and help them understand things that mattered, that in many instances they weren't aware of or did not appreciate the significance of those things. And as I grew, that became storytelling in its truest form. Even though at that point I did not realize obviously what it was. And so in some ways I talk about, stumbling into this career as the epitome of an accident that just happened. And so that's the way I think about that.
How would you say the profession or the field of communications has changed over those years?
Pretty dramatically. And so I've not been in it for that long, but long enough. And I think not surprisingly, social media, digital, are probably the two most significant bookends in my mind. And as a result of those shifts, what that did to empower, audiences or stakeholders, however you think about them, to really be able to use their voices in a way that at times is disruptive, that, at certain times it's valuable, but that change in this balance of the scales, that social enabled for audiences that traditionally we did not have to, treat in the way we do today, or didn't have to consider in the way we do today. And they certainly didn't have, again, the power and influence that they have today because of the advent of the web. I think that's probably foundationally one of the biggest shifts that's impacted, 7-8 layers of things in our discipline beyond that. But if I'm being super thoughtful, I'd probably say that is the most seismic change that we witness.
And the element of social and digital, of course, were also two of the forces that made this profession or this field a lot more complex. We're seeing a rise in complexity, and I'm sure you're feeling that in your day-to-day work. Part of the idea of calling this Always On is also seeing that communication teams are finding a need for themselves and the companies to be always on, because the world is moving a lot faster and there's a lot more expectations. Are you also seeing it from your side, the complexity requiring an always on approach?
Oh, sure. I mean, the need, not just because of the global world we live in today. I think because events can happen, these stakeholders, these audiences, again, have access to tools and mechanisms that can be deployed or leveraged 24/7. So dramatic changes there in terms of just what is the need to have constant awareness, visibility. That's reflected in the way we monitor today, 24/7. And in some ways, it also reflects how the jobs that I have and my counterparts have become much more complex as well, because we by default have to be at least on close to that same, 24/7 view as well, to my family's chagrin. So that's also been another one of those big seismic shifts to your earlier question.
So tell me a bit about how you and your company are always on. So you mentioned, 24/7 monitoring, for example. What are the other aspects, would you say, of your work or the company's attitude are always on?
I mean, the monitoring is a big way that we ensure we keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening across the, for us, 7 to 10 stakeholder groups that matter the most to us as a company. And so we are able to, put a finger in the wind at any moment, in a 24-hour cycle, to understand not just what's happening, but how perhaps what we have done or messages that we put into the marketplace, or things that are happening across any of those constituencies are impacting our brand, our reputation. And so, I mean, that's obviously at its most practical level, we're tools and innovation in the, again, digital space that allowed us to be able to do that in a way that, again, was unheard of 30 years ago. And I think for me, it's probably, like most consumers are probably like you, more a factor of, the apps and the news feeds that I, have, dialed in to just be on constant stream in my device, so that I can at any moment, pick it up and see, what's happening anywhere in the world as well. And so I think that's also, the way that I think about, staying close to that same real-time, always-on reality for all of us, both personally and professionally. But it gets hard sometimes. And so back to the aspiration for me is 8 hours of sleep. I don't remember the last time I got that. And so, but it's still the goal. And that's disrupted most often because, I need to be aware, engaged, or at least cognizant of something happening somewhere in the world, or the potential of something happening somewhere in the world.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the drawbacks of our profession today, that you are expected to be very much plugged in and with a finger on the pulse at all times. Tell us a bit about the technology, the tools that you use, the tech stack you use to help you in that regard.
So on the company side, I mean, I don't think there's anything that would be too shocking in terms of, there are a number of great, partners, vendors that we engage who kind of help us have a view into, what's happening across all these audits and stakeholders, and that essentially enable that 24/7 view. For me, like I mentioned a little earlier, it's probably, for me, 8 or 10 apps that are my go-tos. And then obviously some news feeds, news aggregators as well. And then some of the personal, engagements that I have. There are a couple people that I stay pretty connected to who have their finger even more on the pulse of, what's happening. And so that group of 5 or 10 kind of personal connections, professional connections, that help me stay attuned across, different perspectives. And so back to broadening the aperture and ensuring that, we don't allow ourselves to be, backed into this very tribal view of, news and information and data. A lot of those voices, perspectives are things that are, counter to what, might be my views or my opinions. And so I think that's also a key part of, the value that people sitting in roles like ours have to play as well, have to bring to organizations. It is that awareness, that understanding of the entire spectrum of not just what's happening in the world, but, what our audiences think, believe, or experiencing and encountering, in a way that allows us to be honest brokers who are informed and knowledgeable about many things, many perspectives.
That's an interesting dimension. So it's not really only about the sources and the tools that we use. It's also about the people that we're connected to help us with the interpretation of what's happening all the time, right?
Yeah, even more so today, right? Again, because of the battle and the tribalism that we all live in every day. You've got to make this intentional effort to avoid being, pulled into your corridor with, all of the like voices and perspectives. And so that gets increasingly more challenging with every passing day, it seems.
Interesting point. When it comes to using data, if you can tell us a little bit about how your team uses data in managing communications and stakeholder engagement. You mentioned, obviously, news monitoring. What other type of data points do they use in the day-to-day work?
We have I'd say, fairly sophisticated operation that we built over the last 3 years or so here. And, It's access to, data and analytics that are core to our reputation, our brand, our sentiment in the marketplace. Again, across those stakeholder groups, we look at the levers that influence, trust across those constituencies, are the dimensions of trust across each of those stakeholder groups. And we look at that data pretty consistently and then share that out across our leadership in the company quarterly. Our boss and I talk about it in our ongoing conversations as well. So that's a whole body of work that is fairly robust for us, and I think increasingly is table stakes for organizations like ours.
And is that real-time data or is that periodic typically?
It's both. It's both.
Depending on the stakeholder, I imagine.
Yes, and so that's increasingly important. And so I think for us, that's what we prioritize. And then just ongoing understanding of, again, audiences and stakeholders and perceptions. And so we're leveraging that data to build campaigns, to architect programs, to calibrate programs that are working or may not be working, or to eliminate, activity that's not driving value, creating value for the organization. So it's not all kind of brand reputation monitoring and tracking. It's also much more pragmatic, programmatic data to help us understand where we have white space opportunities as well, and where we may want to lean in or lean out as well. So I think I get super excited about the growth in this space when we think about not just some of the great work that some of our partners are doing to enable us to get deeper and richer in this way, but also the value it brings to us as practitioners to be armed with that level of understanding and insight, which ultimately is going to continue to allow us to play a different role in our organizations, whether that's around the table in the C-suite or around the table wherever it exists in our organizations. I think data will increasingly be one of the most influential tools, weapons we have to continue to carve out a role that is strategic and informed and grounded and sharp and pointy, that also is unique in our organizations, because very few of our counterparts will be able to bring that perspective grounded in data that we can and should be bringing every day.
It sounds pretty advanced within the comm space to have that type of data infrastructure and to use it, as you said, for budget purposes, budget allocation, trying to see where you get more investment and focusing on the more impactful activities. Is that something that you initiated because you saw the value of it? Did you also get any push from the C-suite or CFO, CEO to have more metrics to be able to measure more ROI?
For me, not really a push from the C-suite as much as, and this has been over the course of multiple years now, but I think in the beginning it was a part of a clear desire, and this is still my perspective today, to elevate the stature of the function, to move us up the stack, if you will, away from this construct that historically our function has been attached to, which is the tactical, the doers, the kind of deli counters. That being the reality, if you think about the way that you change that perception and the way the organization historically has shown up is you got to be grounded in some level of understanding of the insights that this data provides for us. And so I think that was really the beginnings of the thought about, well, what do we have available to us that can allow us to begin to make that shift or move up the stack? And so increasingly, from my perspective, this whole body of work is really designed to help us continue to reinforce this role of our teams, our people, our functions as strategists, as business leaders, as operations leaders who can see around every corner, have this wealth of knowledge and perspective similar to our counterparts in finance and legal and IT and every other organization that sits around the proverbial table. And so that was the origin of the investment. And then increasingly, I think as the tools and the capability have matured, and it is my belief that it is critical, I think the desire to have increasingly more sophisticated data available to us, and then to leverage that data to, not just build programs, but to also bring an unbelievable amount of rich insight to the conversations we are able to have with our internal stakeholders, is also part of the critical reason. I think any function that is not leaning heavily in this domain, I'd say, is probably at risk, um, and will be ultimately challenged in the resource, game, where we're competing for dollars against finance and legal and IT, and we can't put up the rationale of it's the right thing to do, or it's a good thing to do, or it'll make us all feel good, because that doesn't work any longer. It's got to be, I can prove to you the value and the impact of this work on creating value for the enterprise, and that's ultimately where we've got to continue to hang our hats.
Definitely. Do you think the fact that you came from a more B2C environment to Medtronic, which is more B2B, do you think that background in B2C has helped you develop a higher level of comfort or sophistication when it comes to using data?
I think, obviously working in a consumer brand, exposes you to a different dimension of, reputation and brand, and, this criticality of insights into your, audiences, your customers, and needing to be so close to that when you're running consumer businesses with, smaller margins where the competition is breakneck, if you will. I think it creates not just a different psyche, but also creates a much more aggressive view of the capability that you need to build to not just understand, but to be able to engage your public, your audiences in a way that is meaningful and accretive, and that, again, ultimately is going to drive value in a way that consumer brands are just forced to operate and behave. That I do think informs my perspective, to your point, in a B2B environment, or B2B2C, which is how I talk about Medtronic today. So I'd say unquestionably.
Now, you mentioned 7 to 10 stakeholder groups, and I want to talk a little bit about this multi-stakeholder aspect. That in itself is also quite extensive. I mean, people typically think about, customers, investors, and employees, which are the first three groups. What are some of the other groups that you are focusing on within your stakeholder universe?
So you think about policymakers, regulators, financial analysts, and for us, given our business, we call them healthcare providers, are also another one of those. And so in the hospital, the C-suite, if you will, the CEOs, the chief procurement officers, and health system leaders is another as well. So if you think about across that entire spectrum, HCPs, that's just those actual physicians, clinicians themselves. And so those 3 or 4 additional stakeholders kind of make up our whole spectrum. When I talk about those audiences that we monitor, engage with directly, and want to make sure that we are pretty dialed into, their psyche.
And how do you manage to communicate effectively and maintain a consistency of the brand across this wide array of stakeholders? Must be a challenge.
It is a challenge. I mean, to your last question, it begins with understanding the who, right? So who actually is it that you're trying to engage, and having a real informed understanding of, to the data and analytics and insights piece, what matters to them, right? How you can engage them, how they prefer to be engaged, not just in terms of messaging, but channels, right? And then to the consistency question, it all starts with a clear understanding of, so what is that consistent message, story, narrative that we know we want to tell across all of these audiences, across all those channels, even though it clearly needs to be dimensionalized depending on the audience, but a clear understanding of what that is, message, right, aligned with a clear understanding of the who, because it's not always the 6 or 7 together as a collective. In some instances, depending on the opportunity or the effort, it may be 1 or 2 or 3 of them, right? So, but again, a clear understanding of what matters to them, how they prefer to be engaged, and where they prefer to be engaged is really how you've got to think about a clear, clean, consistent, easy engagement path in that way that is different, right? Different as opposed to, historically, I would suggest that our perspectives from the function was probably more our audiences are everybody. Even from the consumer vantage point, to your consumer brand question, I think our function used to think that, all the consumers were our audience. And so that was never true, and probably never has been true, isn't true today. And so that real data grounded understanding of, okay, let's get super crisp on the who, which makes all the other downstream decisions, messaging channels, all of that much easier as well. once you've done the work up front.
But I guess the who is also tricky because the lines are getting a little blurry between stakeholder groups, right? So do you find that also evolving or impacting your work?
Yeah, and it's a different way. It's a great question. It's a nuance of this audience segmentation conversation that we were having. So if you think about employees as one of those stakeholders, we often say our employees are consumers as well, right? And even for us in that HCP or the clinician, health system leader community, they're consumers. Even though we've thought about them historically as the B to B, the reality is, people sitting in that B2B environment are consumers. And that's, again, one of the downstream consequences of social and digital, right? It allows someone who may be seen as a traditional B2B stakeholder to really, behave as a consumer, as they probably always have. We convince ourselves of this construct, B2B, B2C, as something that was perhaps a little more meaningful than it was in reality. And so today, everyone's a consumer, regardless of where you sit. And so I think as marketers, brand leaders, and communicators, we've got to disavow ourselves of some of that vernacular, some of that thinking, because it really is old world.
Do you think your background, another twist in your career, I guess, your background in public affairs and your work in Washington, D.C., do you think that made you better at building relationships with stakeholders?
Yeah, I think about this often. I've talked about it, before as well. I think there are many values to having spent so much time in Washington, D.C., in the political environment, the congressional environment. But I think the most significant is probably, to your point, navigating stakeholder relationship, that core relationship management competency that in the political context is unbelievably challenging. I think that was a fascinating experience that ultimately made me a better communicator. When you think about just navigating the relationship spectrum and doing that in a political environment is probably as risky and challenging and thorny as it can possibly be. But that experience for me did ground me in an understanding that is valuable now in a corporate context. When we think about, again, those 7-8 audiences as stakeholders and the imperative of building relationships with them and understanding how to do that, appreciating the competition between stakeholder groups and perspectives, and threading that needle, again, that, political stakeholder management is really a mechanism for allowing you to be expert in and connecting the dots, right? So what is the consistent opportunity for us to engage all of these audiences, whether that's a story, whether that's an idea, whether that's a campaign, whether that's an issue, is core to the work we do as practitioners in a corporate setting, certainly for me, but I'd say core to what the work we do as practitioners, regardless of the environment we're sitting in. And so that was an unbelievably rich experience.
And I imagine probably even more so today that helps you deal with the reality where companies are expected and CEOs are expected more and more to weigh in on political issues and social issues. That's very different from how things were 10, 20 years ago. How do you help the company decide whether or when or how to weigh in on such issues?
Yeah, it's a great question in this environment, that I think is even more important now than it was, certainly 5 years ago when we did not have the number of issues that are happening around us. But, the bigger shift being this trust, levers that have been pulled in terms of organizations, stakeholders, and I think we find ourselves as industry or business today as one of the more highly regarded, voices, stakeholders. And so that when you combine with this kind of broader societal, economic, cultural disruption that we're all witnessing, has created a situation where there is a much more constant expectation that businesses in particular will engage in some of these things. And so to answer your question, navigating around that for us, we spent a lot of time over the last couple of years building a decision-making, organization, entity, process that allows us to not just evaluate, issues when they are presented to us, where we are challenged or invited to have a perspective or to weigh in on an issue, but we've also done the work to identify issues that I describe as issues that are latent to our organization. So those are the things that we are most likely to encounter just by nature of the business that we are in. So healthcare for us, healthcare technology. And so understanding what those potential issues are and then doing the work to navigate a plan to address any of those as they might emerge. That kind of planning and rigor has been core to this, 2+ year exercise for us in building a real approach that allows us to have a process grounded in our business, grounded in our mission, and those things that are of value to us as a company, those things that are core to our character.
Sorry, so you have this in a regular cadence where you get together and you think ahead to see what's coming down the pipe.
Yes, and there's an actual global team that we built within the organization that meets consistently to look at kind of proactive issues, again, to those latent issues, but also it might be engaged in the moment when something emerges today or tomorrow or, in the next 3 days. And so it's ad hoc as well.
And so through that process, do you provide this proactive advice to the CEO also when you think there's an opportunity to actually express an opinion or take a stance?
Yeah, so that group actually generates a recommendation and then a message or a plan if it's something we decide we're going to weigh in, or if it decides that we ought to opt out of weighing in. So that produces a recommendation that comes to me, and that winds up being what I take to my boss, the CEO, and the CEO's leadership team, and then we have a healthy, spirited debate. Sometimes the decision of that group is endorsed, supported. Sometimes there's a bit of a back and forth, and we may ultimately decide to go in a different direction. All right, we use that recommendation from that group to inform a discussion, a debate. But then around that table, consider, again, bringing the business perspective in, the stakeholder perspective as well, but then make a collective decision as a leadership team on yay or nay. So it is a pretty dynamic process.
And who's part of that group?
We call it our Reputation Issues Management Team, and it is representatives of the business functions, certainly of my team. And so it is pretty representative of almost every nook and cranny. So there's global representation. We try to ensure there is clearly gender, cultural, because many of these issues are nuanced depending on where you sit in the world, your perspective. And so we want to make sure we have the benefit of as many perspectives as possible. So it is a pretty broad and global group and representative of almost every aspect of our society that sits within the four walls of our company, at least.
Sounds like a substantial setup that you have there.
I think it's a great model. I would actually argue that it's close to best in breed. And so from what I've seen from my counterparts over the last couple of years, I would hold ours up against, some of the best that are out there.
And are you finding that the discussions are becoming more and more difficult? I mean, given the rise in polarization, especially in America, it must be getting very difficult to have these discussions among such a diverse group of people.
Yeah, I would suggest so. I'm not a member of that group, but from what I hear, and in some ways, that actually is the goal, right? So the goal of that group being as broad and diverse as it is to ensure that there's spirited discussion and debate, and that these perspectives. We talked about this a little earlier about the benefit of multiple perspectives. And ultimately, it ensures a better outcome when you're able to consider every potential, nuance of an issue and the consequence of a decision from the lens of different perspectives and voices and people who, again, represent really unique understandings that most of us won't have. And so that is both the power of diverse perspectives, generally in an organization. And certainly when it comes to, kind of pressure testing some of these thorny issues that we're invited to engage in or to weigh in on, that's an example of why you want as many perspectives around a table to ensure that every potential consideration is debated. And so I hope that conversation continues to be pretty rich and dynamic and challenging, because that's what we need to ensure we ultimately get to the right decision that is considered every risk.
And within that context, let's talk a little bit about diversity. I know it's a topic that you're personally passionate about and have done a lot of work around. And I'm wondering, what is your opinion of the winds that are blowing right now in this arena? What some people refer to as the DEI backlash or the ESG backlash. Again, especially in America, and especially given the polarization that there is in America. How is that affecting your work on diversity?
I know there's a political campaign afoot, right, largely in the U.S. to try and um, take advantage of some of the political sentiment. But I think from my vantage point, again, as a business leader, what I say about this broad question is ultimately for me, I want a high performing team that is going to allow me to compete and win in the marketplace. And so as an organization, we've got a business plan that we've committed to, our board, to, our shareholders, that we're going to deliver, that's going to create value, drive profit and growth. And to deliver on that plan, we need the world's best talent. And so from my vantage point, it's as simple as that. And so then if your aspiration is to compete and win in the marketplace, then you absolutely have to have the best team. And the best team is a factor of, I think, some things that are fairly intuitive to all of us. And so that is my goal. That is my aspiration. That is what I am most concerned about. You cannot tell me at the end of this conversation that the best team is a monolithic team. And so to the conversation about that, reputation issues, management, organization, that dynamism, again, if my commitment is to win in the marketplace and winning is a factor of having the best talent, then I'm going to do whatever needs to be done to ensure I have the best talent.
And have you had any resistance within the organization given that trend, that backlash trend?
To your point, every organization today, living in our society, I think is clearly aware of, and some more than others have been subject to perhaps a little more pressure in this area. But I think our company has been fairly consistent about this concept of competing in the marketplace and having the best talent and ensuring that our workforce is representative of the customers that we support and the broader society at large that we aspire to engage in healthcare. And so I think in some ways, we have been consistent about our views and our perspective, and done the work to ensure that everything that we're doing is above board and is aligned with the reality of laws and regulations that exist in the U.S. in particular, but then more globally as well. And so I think having done that work, we've also continued to be consistent about this is an important topic for us.
Now, when it comes to your role, we talked a little bit about the evolution of the function and the profession, and I want to talk a bit about the evolution of the role, the CCO role. You're, again, in a slightly different position because you're heading both marketing and communications, and that's also interesting. I also want to touch on that. But how would you say the CCO role has evolved over the years?
One of the changes is, again, to this last couple of conversations we've been having, the change in the stakeholder ecosystem, the role, power, influence they have, top, the social and digital transformation of the last couple of decades has been big. I think this opportunity, this challenge for companies that are increasingly being challenged to engage, to influence, some of these macro societal issues, economic issues as well, means that I think as CCOs, as a collective, we're having a different conversation, or expected to have a different conversation, with our, internal stakeholders. And that is dramatically different as well. I think this question that every organization is being challenged to consider about the role of business in society, and in particular, the role of business in a society that is being disrupted along economic and technological and cultural and social means, also means that this role of, CCO, sits atop a lot of that, dynamism, and is the facilitator or navigator of some of these debates internally. And that is wholly different. And I think lastly, one of the things that I think increasingly is becoming the purview of the CCO is really advising and counseling, the organization's senior most leaders on this, navigation journey, which is, a wholly new set of responsibilities. And then if you add lastly to your point, many of these roles are being expanded beyond the traditional to include other areas, other domains. And I think some of that is a reflection of the power and influence of sitting atop these stakeholders and having the accountability or establishing the accountability for that consistency of experience, whether that's across messaging or platforms or audiences. It's an unbelievably important role. And I think increasingly CEOs are seeing the importance of someone who comes from a background like a communicator, or to your earlier question, a stakeholder manager, sitting in that role and being even more critical to the success of an organization than the perception may have been, 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I guess that's also why the profile is gradually changing, right? Because in the past, it was the ex-journalists, which were best at communicating. But as you say, it's more of a stakeholder manager than a communicator now. So the profile's probably changing as well.
Yeah. I mean, you think about the insight required to, one, understand, these divergent audiences who have unbelievable power, who could disrupt your business in minutes or seconds today. And so the ability to understand, kind of navigate that, drive that in a consistent way, really does speak to, I think, the core value of the function, the discipline at its highest and best use. And again, reinforce what I think is going to be a continuation of the expansion of the scope and influence and power of the CCO role that we're seeing today, and that I do believe will be the reality for the next several years as our world gets more complex and challenging.
I remember also hearing you talk at a conference in New York about how leadership is changing in general and how leadership today is a lot more values-based. Is that also, do you think, changing the CCO role, the way that you see leadership in general changing?
I think it is. Again, I think it's a culmination of all the things that we've been talking about and this need to establish a connection from who organizations say they are and who they are in reality, and navigating that continuum. And so that continuum includes, again, all these challenging things we've been talking about. And a lot of that, is grounded in an understanding of the values of the organization. And so part of that accountability, from who we say we are to who we actually are, is also a values conversation as well that you're aligning. It's not just values, it's also business operations and its policies, its procedures, its culture, and ensuring that connectedness so that there is a consistent X or Y, again, whether that's culture, brand, message, story, experience. And that is a increasingly sharp and pointy conversation because of the reality and the environment we live in. And that in some ways is what I've alluded to is going to get more challenging as our world becomes more challenging for the next several years. But that also goes back to that, power and influence of the role, of the function.
Yeah, and when it comes to the power of the function, there's this discussion about, the seat at the table debate that we always hear about in comms. Do you think we're beyond that, or what would be your advice to others who are still trying to get that seat at the table?
I think by and large today, we've in most places gotten the seat. Right now, where the seat is around the table is probably a variable for a lot of us. But I think in generally, again, because of all the things we've been talking about, the stature of kind of the roles we play, I think is at a much more significant level. Reality is, the bigger question is, how do you maintain that seat? And not just that seat as it relates to a person, the seat as it relates to me or you or, some specific individual, but how you maintain that seat for the function, right? So how do we cement that seat as being held by our organization? And that, again, is a factor of, in my opinion, a lot of the things we've been talking about already, which is, a clear understanding of the data, ownership of the data, and the insights that come from that, so that we can have a differentiated point of view, that we bring a differentiated voice, informed, grounded, to that table. And I think a collective understanding of this global reality, right? So understanding the trends that are taking place in the world around us within our stakeholders and also beyond them as well, and being that synthesizer, again, grounded in data, to bring that perspective to the table. And then I think always being a little bit of that sharp, pointy voice in the room, right? So Those are the kinds of competencies and also behaviors that are critical so that ultimately, I think one of the most um, prominent aspirations that are top of mind for me is ensuring that after me, the seat at the table is still there, right? And the person who follows me is able to sit in that seat. And so that's what's increasingly more important than ensuring that I'm at the table. It's ensuring that for the next 25 years, that seat does not move.
I want to finish off with something I usually ask my guests. We talk a lot about the importance of being always on, but how do you switch off?
That's an interesting challenge. Although I do think it has become a lot easier for many of us post the pandemic, right? Where I think we all had this reset of, okay, you know what? I need to make sure I'm prioritizing my mental health. And so I think the pandemic, many horrible things, but some of the benefits were this recalibration for a lot of us about the lines, the boundaries of, what's most critical, our mental health and our collective well-being first, and then whatever that thing is that generates income second. And so that's been key to me. And certainly one of the big takeaways coming out of the pandemic, just given, the challenges of our personal lives that we all navigated during that time. But tactically speaking, I mean, it literally boils down to, there's some days where there's a clear commitment. Okay, I'm turning off my device. And so I let all the people who need to know that, okay, I am out today. And that means I'm actually out. And so you won't hear from me, you won't see me, and then trying to preserve your personal time. So if that can be weekends, my weekends are weekends, right? And so they're not work ends. And so I'm also pretty clear with my team that expectation is the same for them. And so time off is time off. And I don't engage, with my colleagues who are on vacation, my teammates who are on vacation when they're on vacation. And I set that clear expectation. And so I don't want to hear from you, don't want to see you, I don't want to get email from you. And you should expect the same from me. And so I think it's establishing some of those operating mechanisms as a leader, as key to creating a culture, and then having people to understand that it's not just an idea, it's an expectation. And so that's big. And so I try and do that personally and then model that for my teams as well.
Hear, hear. Torod, Neptune, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. I appreciate your time today.
It's great speaking to you as well. Thanks for your time.